Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses for your service and testimony today. One comment, Mr. Chairman, before questions. Over the last month, including yesterday's Senate hearing, we heard a lot of, in my opinion, over-the-top claims that the U.S. had lost all credibility with its allies in the wake of the withdrawal from Afghanistan. Last week, Mr. Chairman, we saw firsthand in Washington how mistaken that claim was. On Wednesday last week, I attended a ceremony over in the Senate where the Australian Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, said that Australia was proud to go into Afghanistan together and leave together, degrading al-Qaeda and preventing a major terrorist attack, and in very heartfelt terms, thanked the United States, particularly the 11 Marines, 1 Navy corpsman, and 1 soldier who perished while safely evacuating 4,100 Australians from Kabul. Boris Johnson, last week, who was also in town when asked about the U.S. standing post-withdrawal, said, "What I said to Joe Biden is how grateful I am for the amazing work of the U.S. military in helping us extricate in 2 weeks 15,000 British nationals from Kabul to whom we owe debts of honor and gratitude. The U.S. military were heroic." Of course, they were in town to enthusiastically endorse AUKUS, the new defense agreement in the Pacific, which, as Politico reported, despite all the hand-wringing over the last couple of weeks, was a powerful reminder that an American security guarantee with our allies still reigns supreme, and in the stroke of a pen has reaffirmed our engagement and collaboration with allies in a region that the National Defense Strategy has identified as our #1 priority. Secretary Austin, I just want to follow up on the August 29th drone strike, and General McKenzie on the 17th, again, gave, I guess, a Central Command investigation report, which described it as a tragic mistake. You also that day announced that there was going to be a DOD follow-up investigation. Can you tell us what is the difference between what you described and what CENTCOM did, and when can we expect to see results from that, that investigation that you described?
Well, I directed a 3-star review of the incident, and certainly it'll take into account all of the things that General McKenzie and his team have done. But we'll look at the soup to nuts policy procedures, whether or not we followed our own practices, our outlined practices, and we'll certainly look at accountability as well. If somebody should be held accountable for something that they did that was outside of standard practice, and then we'll take a look at that. So.
General McKenzie, you mentioned on the 17th that the department is exploring the possibility of ex gratia payments as compensation for the individuals who died in that strike. And again, that's a $3 million per year set aside that the United States military's operation has used over in the past. However, in 2020, despite 23 civilians that were killed, there was no payments made last year. Can you give us some feeling that that this agreement is sufficient to address this issue, which I think really is our country's responsibility?
Sir, I agree with you. I believe we have a significant responsibility here, and I know that even as we speak right now, Undersecretary of Defense for Policy is engaged in finding the best way to move forward on an appropriate ex gratia payment and whatever other measures may be contemplated in regard to that family, and I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you, and I just would reflect that that certainly is a high-volume concern in my district.
Sure.
General Milley, again, we first met in 2013 on a Codell. You were in Jalalabad, Afghanistan, and I think many of us had that same experience of seeing you in country there, and certainly your service is something that I think should be unquestioned in commitment to our nation. In your testimony, you talked again about the Doha Agreement, the conditions that were put into place for the Taliban to perform, and that only 1 out of the 8 actually had been complied with, even up through February. Nonetheless, 80% of the troops in the U.S. were drawn down from the date of the Doha Agreement to January 21st. Can you just talk about the non-compliance of the Taliban throughout 2020 and the predicament that I think this administration was left when it took office with just a fraction of the troop level that was there in February 2020?
We had almost 13,000 U.S. troops there in February 2020. and you got the numbers for inauguration, but the bottom line is reduction in violence, nationwide ceasefire, and a whole series of other.
I apologize, but the gentleman's time has expired.
I'll respond to the record on that. Thank you.
Mr. Lamberton is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We on this committee have repeatedly expressed our concern that the U.S. military does not have regional basing and cooperation agreements required for an effective over-the-horizon counterterrorism capability. In May, Mr. Helvey, in response to my questioning here, confirmed that the administration had not yet secured the necessary agreements with any of the governments in the region to establish these over-the-horizon capabilities. So, General McKenzie, has the administration, as of today, secured any necessary agreements with a neighboring country to provide the basing and overflight requirements needed to perform over-the-horizon counterterror operations in landlocked Afghanistan?
Representative, as of today, I have the ability to enter Afghanistan and to fly missions. It's a long haul in, but I have the ability to do that today.
But no, we don't have an agreement with a neighboring country. Is that true? Isn't that true?
Obviously, it's a neighboring country that's allowing us access, but we are not based in any neighboring country. That's correct, sir.
Okay. So we can safely assume that as of August 31st, we did not also have an agreement at that time in the past. Okay. Thank you. General Milley, at the June 23rd hearing here, you testified to this committee that Bagram was not necessary tactically to the military's withdrawal plan. You dismissed my and other people's concerns about the military value of Bagram, and you seem to base that on an assessment that the Taliban at that point had not yet taken major districts. Yesterday, though, you told Senator Blackburn that one of the courses of action you provided the Commander-in-Chief was to keep Bagram Air Base open, which sounds different from what you told us in January 23rd. But for the record, was it your professional military opinion and advice that we should abandon Bagram Air Base? And if not, was this decision forced on you by the arbitrary troop cap of roughly 650?
Once the President's decision was made in mid-April, 14 April, and we had a change of mission to go to 0 and bring the troops down to a number that was only required to maintain an embassy. The Bagram decision was made at that point because at that point there's no way you could defend both Bagram and HKIA. But one additional point, most of the people that were required to be in a NEO were going to coming out of Kabul.
Withdrawal. Had that been in play?
Well, in order to hold Bagram, I'd have needed to probably pushing 5,000 more troops on the ground. So that would have been a significant decision to hold Bagram. And we were under the direction to go to 0. So it would require a basic policy directive to change the plan. If you're going to go to 0 and you're going to keep enough forces to hold your embassy in the airfield, it is incompatible to go out and hold Bagram under that case. Let me just further add that I did not see any tactical utility to Bagram.
General McKenzie, isn't it true that the President rejected your best military opinion and advice as to how quickly to withdraw American troops from Afghanistan?
Well, I will say this. It has been my view that we should have, that I recommended a level of 2,500, a level that would have allowed us to hold Bagram and other airfields as well. Once you go below that level and make a decision to go to 0, it is no longer feasible to hold Bagram.
But that was your best opinion and advice?
That remains my view now as it was then.
Thank you. And you said to hold Bagram would have taken 2,500. A minute ago, you said 5,000. It sounds like it was 2,500.
Well, it depends on the situation. If you're talking about a situation where you're not fighting the Taliban and you have the full assistance of the Afghan government or the Taliban's attacks against you at a minimum, yes, you can hold it at 2,500. If, however, you posit that you're in Afghanistan, say beyond August the 31st, without the tacit agreement of the Taliban and without the assistance of the government of Afghanistan, who provided most of the physical security at Bagram, then you have to put a big footprint in, just as we did at HKI. It's exactly the same. The two situations are analogous.
Gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Garamendi.
Gentlemen, thank you so very much for your testimony. Before I go any further, I want to acknowledge an extraordinary effort and successful effort made by the U.S. military, particularly the Air Force, in the most awesome and successful evacuation of civilians ever in the history of this world. Well done. Very, very well done, and compliments to all involved in that. Obviously, the loss of the 13 members of the military was a great tragedy, and you and all of us regret that. The fog of war is only repeated by the fog of the committee. So let me lay out some time frames here. In mid-2018, former President Trump ordered formal and direct U.S. Taliban negotiations without the Afghan government participating. In August 2019, President Trump said that he would withdraw all U.S. troops as quickly as possible. In February 2020, the United States and the Taliban signed a formal agreement in which the United States committed to withdraw all of its troops, contractors, and non-diplomatic civilian personnel from Afghanistan no later than May 1st, 2021. In June 2020, the U.S. troop levels reached 8,600. In October, former President Trump tweeted we should have the small number of remaining brave men and women serving in Afghanistan home by Christmas. In November 17, 2020, then Acting Secretary of Defense Milley announced that we will implement former President Trump's orders to continue repositioning forces from Afghanistan, and that 2,500 U.S. troops will remain there by January 15th. On January 15th, he announced that there were indeed 2,500 troops left. On January 20th, Biden became president. 2,500 troops were then in Afghanistan. On April 14th, President Biden announced his intention to continue the withdrawal, all regular U.S. troops, by September 11th, 4 months after the pre-planned May 1st deadline. On July 2nd, Italy and Germany withdrew their troops. On July 17th, we have had specific testimony here on what then happened from July 17th on. And if I recall correctly, the Afghan government completely collapsed on the 20th of August. Wasn't there any longer, and from there, the evacuations commenced. General McKenzie, were the 2,500 troops on the ground sufficient, as agreed with the Taliban? Were they there in accordance with the agreement?
There would have been, had we held the 2,500, which I stated was my position, and as the Secretary has articulated, there would have been a clear risk that the Taliban would have begun to attack us as we move past the 1 May deadline. However, it was my judgment then that that would have still given us a platform to continue negotiations with the Taliban to perhaps force a political solution. My concern was that if we withdrew below 2,500 and went to zero, that the Afghan military and government would collapse. And of course, that's not a potential counterfactual. That is in fact what happened. So we have objective data to understand what happens if you go to zero.
Several of us attended a luncheon here in the Capitol in late June with President Ghani and Abdullah, and they were very, very confident that they would be able to maintain their government through with the reduction and the withdrawal of American troops. If they specifically said they had 300,000 troops, they could do it. They needed continued financial support. They needed the necessary intelligence from the United States. And they also needed to have certain airstrikes, drone strikes. That was their promise. They also said that they did not want to allow Afghans to leave. That's what they specifically told us. They did not want Afghans to leave. Obviously, Ghani decided that he would leave. What further questions? My time has expired. I'll yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Whitman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, thanks so much for your testimony today. General Milley, I want to begin with you, and I want to build on a question that Ranking Member Rogers asked. On August 18th, President Biden said that there's no way possible that U.S. troops could be withdrawn from Afghanistan without the chaos that we saw unfold. In your best military judgment, was there a way to extract the troops without the chaos that we saw unfold?
I just want to be clear, we're talking two different missions. The retrograde of the troops, the 2,500 everybody's talking about, those are advisors. That was complete by mid-July, and that was done actually without any significant incident. And that's the handover of 11 bases, the bringing out of a lot of equipment, et cetera. That was done under the command of General Miller. The non-combatant evacuation operation is different. Non-combatant operation, that was done under conditions of great volatility, great violence, great threat, and we inserted 6,000 troops on relatively short notice because there were some contingency plans to do that. That's a different operation, and I think that the first 2 days of that, as we saw, were not only chaotic but violent and high risk, but because of the skill and leadership of our troops, they were able to get control of a situation in an airfield in a country that was falling apart, and then execute the operation. So I think it would have been difficult under any circumstances, and I think our soldiers performed extraordinarily well, actually, in 48 hours getting control of an airfield in another country, 8.5 time zones away.
But I understand that, but you're talking about a very compressed time frame. I'm talking about the full extent about what you're looking at. You can talk about two missions, but I'm talking about in totality of what we're looking at there was a chaotic and disaggregated effort. It seems like to me that your professional military judgment would probably not have been focused in your recommendations in seeing this outcome. I just wanted to get from your
my
standpoint,
recommendations at the time and my analysis at the time were aligned actually with what you've heard from General Miller previously and General McKenzie was flatline at about 2,500 and go for a negotiated solution and make sure it's conditions-based. And we all render our advice, presidents make decisions, and then we execute.
Sure. This morning, you stated that the withdrawal was a logistical success but a strategic failure. And I would say that probably American citizens and the special immigrant visa holders would probably disagree. Those that were left behind would probably disagree with your assessment of a logistical success. That being said, I want to focus on the strategic failure aspect of that. You said yesterday that all you can do, and you just said it now, all you can do is provide your best advice, and it's up to the president to make the ultimate decision. In your best military judgment, did President Biden's decisions cause this strategic failure?
I think, as I said yesterday, first of all, I'm not going to judge a president. That's the job of the American people. That's the job of Congress, not my job.
I'm asking for your best military judgment, for your judgment.
My assessment is this is a 20-year war, and it wasn't lost in the last 20 days or even 20 months for that matter. There's a cumulative effect to a series of strategic decisions that go way back. Bin Laden, right on the Tora Bora, for example. We knew where he was. We were 1,000 meters away. Could have ended it perhaps right there. The shift from going into Iraq and pulling all the troops out of Afghanistan, with the exception of a few others. Major strategic decision. Not effectively dealing with Pakistan as a sanctuary. Major strategic issue that we're going to have to really unpack. The intelligence piece, pulling advisors off 3 or 4 years ago out of Kandax, so we blinded ourselves to our ability to see the will, the morale, the leadership, and the training. There's a whole series of decisions that take place over 20 years. I don't think that whenever you get some phenomena like a war that is lost, and it has been, in the sense of we accomplished our strategic task of protecting America against al-Qaeda, but certainly the end state is a whole lot different than what we wanted. So whenever a phenomena like that happens, there's an awful lot of causal factors, and we're going to have to figure that out. A lot of lessons learned here.
Thank you. And I want to build with your answers to Secretary Austin. Secretary Austin, imagine that you had a number of opportunities in your capacity as CENTCOM Commanding General to brief President Obama, and I imagine that Vice President Biden was probably privy to these briefs. Was he a regular attendee when you gave these briefs?
The Vice President was frequently in the Situation Room when we conducted meetings, yes.
Gotcha. Let me go from there then to the Battle of Kunduz, which we know Taliban took over, Afghan forces retreated. Did you recognize that as the beginning of the weakness in the ISAF mission? And were there issues at that point of intense interest to Vice President Biden?
I'm sorry, that's going to have to be a question for the record because the time has expired. Ms. Spear is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for your extraordinary service to our country. I want to just set the record straight on a couple of points. It was in 2017 that then President Trump relaxed rules of engagement for airstrikes, and there was a massive increase in civilian casualties, a 330% increase during Trump's administration. Compared to the previous 10 years, there was a 95% increase in civilian deaths from 2017 to 2019. It was then President Trump who in mid-2018 ordered talks with the Taliban without the Afghani leadership. And it was in February 2020 when that formal agreement was made. Now, Chairman Milley, you identified the Taliban as a terrorist organization. Can you tell us anything about former President Trump's intent to invite the Taliban leadership to the United States or to Camp David specifically?
I have no personal knowledge of that invitation. I saw it in the media, but I was not part of any discussions or decision-making on that. I have no personal knowledge.
Secretary Austin, did the previous administration develop plans for withdrawal? And was there any handoff to you of those plans?
There was no handoff to me of any plans for withdrawal.
So then President Trump calls for a total withdrawal by May 1st, 2021, and no plans had been made during his administration for withdrawal.
I would say that, I'm confident that General Miller, who was anticipating a decision one way or the other, was making plans, and I certainly would defer to General McKenzie in terms of what he might have done. But in terms of handoff from administration to administration, secretary to secretary, there was no handoff to me.
All right. Is it not true that on April 27th, President Biden, through the State Department, called on all Americans in Afghanistan to leave by commercial flights? Can any of you answer that question? Well, that was in fact what happened.
I don't have knowledge of that.
All right. That was in fact what happened. So we put on notice all Americans in Afghanistan on April 27th. It was time to get out. Let me ask you this, General Milley. What was the impact of President Trump's drawdown to 2,500 troops despite the Taliban's noncompliance with much of the peace agreement? And how did that affect our intelligence gathering?
So there's two questions there. The first question, I think the Doha agreement itself, because of the nature of it, and this is more 2020 hindsight perhaps, but we now believe that the Doha agreement itself perhaps undermined or contributed to the undermining of the morale, confidence of the government because it was a bilateral agreement, et cetera. But having said that, there were conditions built into that, one of which was met, many of which were not. And the drawdown to 2,500 proceeded because of the fundamental condition of they weren't attacking us was being met. The drawdown to 2,500, the impact that that had on the morale, the will of the Afghan military, I believe that it was a negative impact, but I don't know that yet. We need to go through all of our intelligence and analyze it in an after-action review, but I do think that was a contributing factor to the morale of the Afghan security forces.
General Milley, there's been a lot of talk about retaining 2,500 service members in Afghanistan. I think we all forget that there was a negotiations with the Taliban, and we would have to get them to agree to allow 2,500 troops to remain in the country. Having said that, in your view, would a small force of 2,500 be sufficient to achieve anything of value?
I think that the 2,500 would have been at great risk in terms of the Taliban. I have no doubt that the Taliban would have reinitiated combat operations or attacks on U.S. forces, and the 2,500 would have been at increased risk to that. What's the value of keeping the 2,500? It has as much to do with the morale and the keeping advisors with them and having the morale of the Afghan security forces and demonstrating confidence in the government. Going to zero, it's clear to me that one of the big lessons learned we have to unpack from the military side is the mirror imaging and the development of the Afghan military. And they became dependent upon our presence.
I apologize, but the gentlelady's time has expired. Ms. Hartzler is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's imperative that we have this hearing today because the botched withdrawal from Afghanistan, I believe, is the most significant foreign policy failure in a generation, and it's going to have ramifications for years to come. And so we need to get to the bottom of this. And first I want to start off to General Milley, a question that you made a comment earlier that you'd be, well, I wanted to ask you, did you tell General G when you talked to him on the phone that if we were going to attack China that you would let him know ahead of time?
What I said, this is a longer conversation. I can have it share all clearly indicates the Chinese concern.
I'm sorry, could you get the microphone a little more in front of you there? Make sure it's on.
Yes.
So this is a longer conversation. It's a VTC with General Lee. And there's a body of intelligence that leads up to this that was persuasive to Secretary Esper, myself, and many, many others, that the Chinese thought wrongly that the United States was going to attack them. I am certain, guaranteed certain, that President Trump had no intent to attack. And it was my task to make sure I communicated that. And the purpose was to de-escalate, calm things down.
You shared all that earlier, I understand.
And as part of that,
just say, did you or did you not tell him that if we were going to attack, you would let him know?
as part of that conversation, I said, General Lee, there's not going to be a war, there's not going to be an attack between great powers. And if there was, the tensions would build up. There'd be calls going back and forth from all kinds of senior officials. I said, hell, General Lee, I'll probably give you a call, but we're not going to attack you. Trust me, we're not going to attack you. These are two great powers, and I am doing my best to transmit the President's intent, President Trump's intent, to ensure that the American people are protected from an incident that could escalate.
I understand your intent, but I think you articulating that you would tell him, you would give him a call, I think is worthy of your resignation. I just think that's against our country, that you would give our #1 adversary that information and tell him that. But I'd like to go on to General Austin and ask you a question. According to President Biden, he chose you to serve as his defense secretary primarily because that you oversaw the full withdrawal of U.S. forces in 2011 from Iraq. But ironically, the 2011 Iraq withdrawal left similar conditions of governmental failure, the empowerment of regional terrorist organizations, most notably ISIS, and a humanitarian crisis of refugees and internally displaced people in desperate need of international emergency assistance. The 2011 U.S. military exit from Iraq was short-lived, with President Obama redeploying U.S. forces into Iraq and Syria in 2014 to defeat the Islamic State. Despite the administration's reassurances, it seems we may be in a similar trajectory in Afghanistan. After U.S. forces abandoned Bagram Air Base in July, the Taliban quickly took over the base and released 5,000 to 7,000 ISIS-K and Taliban prisoners. When the last U.S. troops evacuated from Afghanistan on August 31st, this administration handed over total government control to the Taliban, a known terrorist organization with leaders of the Haqqani terrorist network now in key positions within the Taliban's de facto government. And in recent weeks, the Taliban has deemed education irrelevant, barred women and girls from school and work, committed horrific retaliatory attacks on members of Afghan security forces and interpreters, and established suicide bomber schools within the country. We also know that al-Qaeda and ISIS-K both have reestablished a presence within the country. Even before the U.S. withdrew, ISIS-K claimed credit for a suicide bombing, which you have mentioned, took the lives of 13 service members on August 23rd. So, Secretary Austin, is it true that the suicide bomber who attacked the Kabul airport on August 23rd was a CIA prisoner at the Bagram Air Base whom the Taliban released after Biden's administration left Bagram in July?
Let me just say a couple of things. First, on why the President selected me or nominated me to be his Secretary of Defense. You'd have to certainly go back to the President and ask him specifically why he did that. But it wasn't, I'm sure, solely based upon my oversight of the evacuation of Iraq. But I would point to you that there's a government in Iraq right now that's holding elections. The United States military is in Iraq.
I have 4 seconds. Could you answer my question? Was the suicide bomber?
Gentlelady's time has expired.
I'll take your question for the record.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Gallego.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And generally, I don't see eye to eye with many generals, and certainly General Milley and I have had disagreements, but I think what was said earlier was inappropriate in its nature to accuse a member of the military that they would tip off our opposition in any way. And I'd like to give General Milley an opportunity to respond to that if he wants, and if not, then I'll gladly continue with my questions.
As I said up front, I'm not going to tip off any enemy to what the United States is going to do in an actual plan. What I'm trying to do is persuade an adversary that's heavily armed, that was clearly and unambiguously, according to intelligence reports, very nervous about our behavior and what was happening inside this country. And they were concerned that President Trump was going to launch an attack. He was not going to launch an attack. I knew he wasn't going to launch an attack. At the direction of the Secretary of Defense, I engaged the Chinese in order to persuade them to do that. I would never tip off any enemy to any kind of surprise thing that we were going to do. That's a different context than that conversation.
Thank you, General. Thank you to all 3 witnesses for taking the time to testify today. Obviously, the resurgence of the Taliban is devastating and is difficult for many of us to watch. But sadly, it underlines the reality that after 20 years, 4 U.S. presidents, and billions of dollars, the conditions for a peaceful and stable Afghanistan could not be created. That is why I believe President Biden made the right decision to withdraw. Staying in Afghanistan, a prolonged and stalled conflict would have required more troops and more resources with no clear timeline. And I don't believe that we could ask our servicemen and women to give their lives for a mission that in the end wouldn't have been successful. I do, like many of you here, applaud our troops for the tireless effort to evacuate American citizens, our allies, Afghan citizens, and everyone threatened by the Taliban. And I still believe we have a moral imperative to help those who helped us in Afghanistan. And I and many of us will do everything in our power to continue to do that. I have some questions to begin with. General Milley, in your testimony, you know that the speed and scope of the collapse of the Afghan army and the government was a surprise. Yet the Taliban was clearly gaining ground in June and especially July before their arrival in Kabul. As we not only look toward the future of Afghanistan, but also think about our operations across the globe, what lessons specific to our intelligence gathering and analysis do you think DoD can learn from this experience? Do you think it's time for a larger rethink within the department about how to assess intelligence in a very rapidly changing environment?
I do. I don't know the full answer yet, but I think that the primary reason we missed it was because we essentially cannot, and we have yet to develop a really effective technique to read people's hearts, their will, their mind, their leadership sort of skills. Those are intangibles. You know, the moral is to the physical is 3:1 in the conduct of war. So very difficult to measure. When we pull our advisors off of organizations at lower levels, you start missing that fingertip touch for that intangible of war. We can count the trucks and the guns and the units and all that. We can watch that from different techniques, but we can't measure a human heart from a machine. You got to be there to do that, and I think that was probably one of the most significant contributing factors to missing the deterioration in the morale of the Afghan army.
And I guess one of the things that I'm deeply disturbed by, and this can be either to General McKenzie or also Secretary Giles can jump in, speaking to a lot of service members, enlisted service members that have served for decades in and out of Afghanistan, they were always telling me something extremely different from what I was getting from reports from many of you generals here, that the Afghan army was not ready, that they were not going to be sustainable on their own. And so that, how did we miss that? How is it that a lot of, 18, 19-year-olds, mid-20-year-old E5s were predicting this, but yet some of our greatest minds, both on civilian side and, uniform side, absolutely missed this. And I think that's something that concerns me because, Afghanistan is done, but we're going to be obviously engaging all over the world. And this type of intelligence failure repeated could be, could be an existential threat to the national security of the United States. I don't know, General McKenzie, if you want to try that?
Sure. So I think it's a reasonable criticism. We'll have to take a look at how we actually remain connected to the people who are down at the advisory level. I think that's something that I'm conflicted by that as well. I'll be very candid with you. And we will certainly take a look at that, because I've heard that same strain myself. It's harder to get the truth as you become more senior. We perhaps need to look at ways to ensure that that's conveyed in a more rapid and effective way. So I'll accept that criticism.
Thank you for your guys' testimony. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Scott is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And gentlemen, I need your help fairly immediately on two issues, one of which can't be discussed in this setting, but the other one can. And there are 145 Afghan Air Force personnel in Tajikistan. They flew 16 aircraft into that country on August the 13th. It's now September the 29th. We need to get them out of Tajikistan. These are people who trained with us, they fought with us, that they did everything that we asked of them, and we have gotten no assistance at all from the State Department to move them. And I'm asking all three of you for your help in addressing the issue. Secretary Austin, we need the help.
Acknowledged, sir, and we will get with State right away to see if we can move this forward. But I share your concern, sir.
And thank you. And I do want to mention this, and I think this is where the frustration of every member of the committee comes in, that we had people in Uzbekistan. The State Department ignored them as well and said they would get to them when they got to them. But we have a lady in Tajikistan that's 9 months pregnant that's one of our pilots. And we need help removing them. We also need to make it clear to Uzbekistan and Tajikistan that is U.S. military equipment, and it is not to be returned to Afghanistan. And so I would appreciate if we could put that in writing to both of those countries, that the equipment belongs to the U.S., not to Afghanistan. You know, with that said, I appreciate your commitment to help. I do want to mention one thing, Secretary. You, State Department, we're using the number 124,000. That 124,000 is U.S. and NATO allies, correct?
That's correct.
We had provided a list of names of people who were P1, P2 SIVs to Central Command, to everybody we knew to get it to. And yet our people were not allowed into, but they were not allowed into HKIA, even though they were on the manifest. And yet so many people came out of the country that appeared not to be on the manifest. So how was the determination made, and who got on a plane and who didn't get on a plane?
Well, I can't and they helped us with some security issues and other things while they were there. So.
Secretary, I'm close on time, but I will tell you, I do think that that's a question that is going to linger and that the committee wants answers on, because we have P1, P2 SIVs that were left behind, and other people that were not or should not have been on the manifest seem to have gotten out.
Well, I would just tell you, we're going to continue to work to try to get as many out as we can. In the last 48 hours, I think we've brought out an additional 63 American citizens and 169 legal permanent residents. So we're going to continue to work this.
General McKenzie, you answered a lot in testimony. You did say that in April is when you were given effectively a change of mission to the 650. What date in April was that?
I believe it was on the 15th.
The 15th, so mid-April.
Yes.
When did we inform our partner forces that we had a change in mission,
and that we were going to retrograde from the 2,500 down to 650?
That followed immediately, and that was through Scott Miller's
Immediately.
headquarters on the ground.
Okay.
The process of outreach, both to President Ghani and to other members. It might have taken a couple of days for that process, but it was not kept from them.
Okay, it wasn't a secret. Very quick, was the 650 included in the 2,500, or is the 650 in addition to the 2,500 number?
The 650 were different capabilities than the 2,500.
So it would have been a total of 3,150?
No. When we went from 2,500 down to an effective zero, we said we would keep 650.
They went from
to protect
25.
the embassy.
Yeah. Gentleman's time has expired. They went from 2,500 to 650, as I understand it, on their way to.
That is correct, sir, but the capabilities were different. They were different forces to do different things.
Crucial point. Thank you. Mr. Moulton is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General Milley and Secretary Austin, my first question to you at our hearing on June 23rd was, why have you not started the evacuation of our allies already? You responded that we have a, quote, moral imperative to save the Afghans who work by our side. Secretary Austin, you said earlier today that moving too slow with the evacuation would put our troops at risk. So I want to know what you did personally, all three of you, between that June 23rd hearing and August 15th when Kabul fell to meet that moral imperative. Now, I hope it's a long list of things, so I'll take that for the record. But let me ask you this. Do you believe you did enough, Chairman Milley?
I do. I think that we provided the advice necessary at the time. I think, yes.
Secretary
Short answer
Austin.
is yes.
Yeah, I think you heard me say in my opening comments that we engaged state early on to provide input to their decision-making process on when to move the SIVs. And
I understand that, Mr. Secretary. You said that you and the State Department followed the advice of the Ghani government that taking out SIVs would precipitate a government collapse. Yet the vast majority of these heroes weren't even working for us or the government anymore because they supported a force of up to 100,000 U.S. troops over 20 years. And we only had 2,500 troops left. So why on earth did you trust President Ghani?
Again, not my decision. To your point, I had input to that decision-making process, but it's not as if I was influenced by President Ghani.
I understand, Mr. Secretary. So you've said this repeatedly, that this is state's responsibility. What responsibility do you have for the Afghans who stood shoulder to shoulder with our troops, and how many do you commit to getting out by the end of the year?
I have a responsibility to get out as many as I can over time, and how many do I commit to getting out? Every one that I can.
General McKenzie, there are DoD reports that DoD reduced airstrikes as early as May, when troops were just beginning to withdraw, then had to ramp them back up after the Taliban gained ground. There are also reports that you sat down with the Taliban leadership in August, drew a circle around Kabul, and told them that if the Taliban fighters went inside that circle, they would get hit with U.S. airstrikes. So why did you let up on the Taliban first at the beginning of May, and then at the end of our withdrawal in August, right when we should have been hitting them harder to give Americans and Afghan partners time to evacuate?
Representative, the report about me meeting with is simply factually incorrect.
Okay, what about May?
In May, as through the rest of our redeployment period, we continued strikes on the Taliban. Those strikes, however, were limited to support of Afghan forces in close combat. We were not striking deep, and we did not have a tremendous amount of resources compared to resources that we've had in the past. So those strikes, while effective in certain tactical situations, at no time were enough to change the strategic calculus of the campaign.
General McKenzie, you went from 2,500 troops in Afghanistan in April to 650 in July, and then turned around and put 5,000 back into Kabul. Now, you've said repeatedly that you personally believe the Afghan government would fall if we didn't maintain a certain number of troops in country. So why didn't you plan for an evacuation and leave enough troops on the ground to conduct it?
So let's be very clear. The evacuation has to be ordered by the Department of State. The drawdown of U.S. forces was ordered by the President in April and completed in July. The non-combatant evacuation operation is a separate mission, and it was not completely under the control of the Department.
So you're going to fall back on the bureaucracy, the divide between DOD and state?
Well, Representative, I'm going to fall back on the orders that I
got. Out and then had to put more back in?
I'm going to fall back on the orders that I receive, Representative.
Secretary Austin, you presided in part over the withdrawal of forces from Iraq, though I know you at times requested more troops on the ground. 2 years later, we had to send thousands of troops back into Iraq. Do you believe we will ever have to send troops back into Afghanistan?
Well, I certainly want to engage in a hypothetical. I would just say that obviously that's a decision that has to be made by the president. You know, while I won't rule anything out, I would just say it's not preordained that we will go back or have to go back into Afghanistan again. So, but if we do, the military will provide good, credible options to be able to do that and to be effective. On the strikes,
Gentlemen, you and your predecessors asked tens of thousands of young Americans to fight in Afghanistan, and they did, and thousands died. And now you keep saying that our troops should be proud of that. Well, here's a question sent to me by one of those soldiers. In 20 years, our troops on the ground never lost a single battle, yet we lost the war. And we're losing it over and over again the longer we leave our allies behind.
The gentleman's time has expired.
So what is left to be proud of?
Seth, we're trying to run a meeting here. And if you wanted to read that letter, you should have read it in the first 5 minutes when you have time. So I think it's something we need to hear, and it's something we should have heard during the 5 minutes that you had. The gentleman's time has expired. Ms. Stefanik is recognized. She is appearing virtually. Ms. Stefanik, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Smith. I want to first start off by saying that I'm honored and privileged to represent Fort Drum, home of the 10th Mountain Division, the most deployed division in the U.S. Army since 9/11. And I want to take this opportunity to thank every soldier, every serviceman and women for deployment after deployment after the past 2 decades. The North Country, this committee, and this country are forever grateful for your service and sacrifice of both you and your families. I want to direct my question, the first question, to any of you on the panel today, and it's about the evacuation and force protection efforts at the Hamid Karzai International Airport. Force protection efforts were made specifically as the ISIS-K threat intelligence came in before and after the suicide bombing at the airport.
So, Representative, first of all, the 10th Mountain was a key part of our defense there at the airport, and I certainly appreciate their contribution to it. Force protection is something we balanced all the time against the requirement to let people come in and be processed and get on the airplanes. So we looked at that every day. And as you know, those two things are in tension, and you have to balance them every day. We had over 300 credible intelligence reports of ISIS-K attacks, plans to attack the airport. Turns out that they were able to carry out one successful suicide vest attack. They also launched rockets at us. There were many other attacks that we were able to either vector Taliban elements onto to prevent, or perhaps the Taliban were able to prevent those by the outer cordon that they established. But force protection was a key thing that we balanced throughout the entire operation, and we thought the risk was very high at all time. Again, principally from ISIS-K, and I'll pause there, ma'am.
I'm going to follow up. We depended upon the Taliban for security to get the evacuees and Americans behind enemy lines into the airport. Did the United States or coalition forces provide money, any form of payment or assistance to the Taliban to expedite the evacuation of Americans as the security environment in Kabul deteriorated?
No, we did not. What we did was we asked the Taliban to establish a cordon about 1,000 meters, 1 kilometer beyond each of the gates, where we could reduce the number of people that were coming down and showing up at the gates, so we wouldn't have the possibility of a mass attack. They did that. They were not compensated or rewarded in any way for that. It was a very pragmatic, business-like discussion. I don't trust the Taliban. I didn't trust them then. I don't trust them now. So that was the method, that was the way we approached it.
Thank you, General McKenzie. And Secretary Austin, I just want to get the department on record in addition to General McKenzie's answer. So there was no form of payment by the U.S. or coalition forces at any time during the evacuation to the Taliban?
To my knowledge, there was none.
And Chairman Milley?
I have no knowledge of any money that transmitted from any element of the United States government to the Taliban whatsoever.
My next question is, we are 20 years from the attacks on 9/11, and I obviously am from the state of New York, and it is a very, very solemn occasion for all Americans, but particularly New Yorkers every year as we commemorate that date. I would like to get your assessment. Is the terrorist threat from Afghanistan greater today or lesser than it was pre 9/11? I'll start with you, Chairman Milley.
I think right this minute, it is lesser than it was in 9/11. However, I think the conditions are set or could be set, and I testified to this yesterday, I say it again, I've said it in public many times. The conditions could be set for a reconstitution of al-Qaeda and or ISIS, and I gave some specific times in my statement, and I stand by those. I think that it's a real possibility in a not too distant future, 6, 12, 18, 24, 36 months, that kind of time frame, for reconstitution of al-Qaeda or ISIS, and it's our job now, under different conditions, but it's our job to continue to protect American citizens against attacks from Afghanistan.
Secretary Austin, your response to that question?
I would agree with General Milley that al-Qaeda has been degraded over time. Now, terrorist organizations seek ungoverned spaces so that they can train and equip and thrive, and so there is clearly a possibility that that can happen here going forward. Our goal is to maintain a laser-like focus on this so that it doesn't happen.
And I apologize, the gentlelady's time has expired. Mr. Carbajal is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to all our witnesses that are here today. And I want to start by one of the things I like about this committee is that we're pretty bipartisan. But every once in a while, the partisan beast comes out. And I'm sure it happens from both sides of the aisle. This is my third term here. The administration from the other party, not in power, is oftentimes, depending what perspective you come to it, one is doing everything right and the other one is doing everything wrong. And I think it's important to shed light on things irrespective of the partisanship. One can argue that the agreement that President Trump reached with the terrorist Taliban in February 2020 was less than perfect, and we should call that from both sides of the aisle. And we can also argue that the exit from the withdrawal was less than perfect. I certainly can say that I supported the Trump administration and the Biden administration in its goal to withdraw from Afghanistan. But again, it's been less than perfect. And so for me, I just want to shed a little bit of light on and refresh some of the memory on some of the numbers, going back a little ways. So General Milley, I want to make sure that I understand our troop levels since the Doha Agreement that was reached with the terrorists and by President Trump between February 2020, when the agreement with the Taliban was signed, to January 2021, and how many troops did the United States withdraw from Afghanistan? How many troops were withdrawn from January 2017 to January 2021?
12,600 U.S. troops when the Doha Agreement was signed on that day. 8,000 NATO.
Can you repeat that again?
12,600 U.S. troops on 29 February 2020, with 8,000 NATO and 10,500 contractors, and the contractors are particularly important here. With respect to, on Inauguration Day, I'm showing 3,500 U.S. troops. That's the 2,500 advisors, and then there were some additional enablers that were there. 3,500 U.S. troops on 20 January, 5,400 NATO, and 6,300 contractors in Afghanistan on that day.
Thank you. And I only draw attention to that to show the withdrawal that started many years before. Secretary Austin and Secretary Milley, General Milley, over the course of the 20 years in Afghanistan, the United States Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction estimates that the United States spent $83 billion equipping and training the Afghanistan National Defense and Security Forces, which included almost $10 billion in aircraft and vehicles. We all saw the unexpected and appalling rate of how quickly the Afghan military folded under pressure from the Taliban. What do U.S. train and equip efforts in Afghanistan suggest about security cooperation, operations going forward? And what aspects about train and equip efforts do you think the department should reassess?
Yeah, I'll turn it over to General Milley here very quickly, but I think we should reassess everything, soup to nuts. I think we put a valiant effort into providing the Afghans with a great capability, and at the end of the day, that capability was not employed because the security forces fractured and essentially evaporated. So we need to look at ourselves to see, you know, what we did and whether or not that's the right thing to do going forward. So, Mark.
In my view, Congressman, I think when we do security force systems, one of the things we have to guard against is mirror imaging. I think from the very beginning with the Army, the Afghan Army, we wanted to create them in the image of the U.S. Army. I think our success story is the commandos with the Special Forces piece, but the broader Army became a mirror image in our tactics, our doctrines, et cetera. That's one point. Second point is the police forces. That was assigned under the Bonn Agreement in 2002 to the Germans. The Germans wanted to make Polizei and that sort of thing. And the third and last point is they became dependent upon us, contractors, U.S. Air Support, et cetera, and we have to avoid dependency on U.S. forces.
Gentleman's time has
expired.
Dr. Desjardins is recognized.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you all for being here today to answer our questions. I've had so many questions come from constituents in Tennessee that there's no way we can even begin to get through them in 5 minutes, but let's jump right in. General Milley, on Bagram, in your professional military opinion, which facility, HCI or Bagram Airfield, would have been most efficient in conducting the evacuation that we were forced to do?
HCI, and there's a reason for that. The vast majority of those personnel that we expected to have to conduct a NEO with were located in Kabul. That's point one. Point two is we were directed to maintain an embassy open and also the international zone for the other allied nations. So we had to do it out of HCI. Bagram would have been, you know, a plus, but it would have required exceptional levels of resources to do that.
Okay. I think all of you testified yesterday that it wasn't a matter of if the Afghan army would fail and the Taliban would take over, as a matter of when. You were all shocked by the rate at which it happened. The billions of dollars in equipment that was left behind has been under much scrutiny. Knowing that they were going to fail, why were more steps not taken to secure that military equipment or destroy it, knowing that now it's a well-equipped Taliban army?
Yeah, so the number is a big number, so let me unpack that a little bit. First of all, the $84 billion included all of the...
I understand that. Let's just cut right to the equipment that was left behind. Why was so much left behind? Aircraft, MRAPs, weapons. Why was that there when you knew they were going to fail?
The other thing I would say is that, you know, all of the equipment that we had that we were using, as I stated earlier, was evacuated by General Miller. Now, the reason that the Afghans had the equipment they had is because we wanted them to be successful, and they could not be successful without the appropriate.
Okay, if they're watching these hearings yesterday and today, I'm guessing that they probably feel like they were played as fools because you all just said you knew they were going to fail. So here we have an army we built up, we used them until we didn't need them anymore to accomplish Biden's objective and Trump's objective of getting out of Afghanistan. However, it went horribly wrong, as we can probably all agree to. General Milley, you started today and talked about your commitment to your office. You're the principal military advisor to the president, correct?
That is correct.
And that's to President Trump and President Biden.
That's correct, and the Secretary of Defense and the National Security Council.
Okay, and Senator Blackburn yesterday asked you about your conversations with several book writers, and you were fine with giving them your opinion, and I think you said that you had a rather blunt and forward phone call with House Speaker Nancy Pelosi.
True.
And she was concerned over the safety of nuclear weapons.
Correct.
Okay. In a transcript obtained from CNN Political, Woodward and Costa quoted Pelosi as saying, and this was to you, what I'm saying to you is that they couldn't even stop him from an assault on the Capitol. Who even knows what else he may do? And is there anybody in charge of the White House who was doing anything but kissing his fat butt all over this? Is that, do you recall that?
I haven't seen the transcript.
Well, I think that would be firmly imprinted on my mind if
there was a
Speaker
lot
of the House
of,
told me that.
I would just say there's a lot of disparaging comments made, my focus was to assure her that the nuclear system and weapons were under control.
Okay, and according to Costa and Woodward, she went on to say, you know he's crazy. He's been crazy for a long time, to which they say, and I'm sure you haven't had a chance to read the book yet, Milley responded, Madam Speaker, I agree with you on everything. If you're the principal advisor to the president, and she said that to you, do you think that you were doing service to a president by agreeing with the speaker that your commander-in-chief is crazy?
I actually said, I'm not qualified to assess the mental health of the president. What I'm agreeing to is that we have to have a secure nuclear system.
Okay. Have you had any conversations with the Speaker or any of our foreign leaders about our current president's mental capacity? We have a physician right here on the panel who was the personal physician of the prior 3 presidents who said President Biden should take a mental competency test, and we see it in the press, his lack of ability to answer questions. Have you had any conversations with anybody concerning his ability to carry out a nuclear order or any other serious engagements?
No, and my answer would be the same. I'm not qualified to evaluate a president's mental health or your mental health or anybody's mental health. I'm not a doctor.
But you were concerned about Trump. You said you were concerned about him when you made the calls to China.
No, I didn't. What I said to the call to China was I guarantee you that President Trump is not going to attack you in a surprise attack. I was carrying out his intent, President Trump's intent, in order to protect the American people and prevent an escalation or an incident.
That was helpful. Mr. Brown is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Each of my questions have been asked and answered this morning. Therefore, I'll use this seldom opportunity with the 2 most senior officials of the Pentagon to make a statement. We cannot ask our men and women in uniform to fight forever wars, and I commend President Biden for recognizing this reality and bringing our troops home. But we know the threats facing our country aren't solely on distant battlefields. For decades, we've grappled with extremist ideologies within our own civilian communities and our military ranks. And there are no signs that we're winning this fight. As FBI Director Wray testified before the Senate Judiciary Committee earlier this year, January 6th was not an isolated event. Director Wray stated the problem of domestic extremism has been metastasizing across the country for a long time now, and it's not going away anytime soon. We know now that 12% of those charged in the riot on the Capitol have military experience, with at least 1 indicted rioter on active military duty. That's well above the participation rate of adults in the military. The last time you both were before this committee, you spoke about the issue of extremism in our armed forces. General Milley, you stated, from private to general, there's no room for extremist behavior in the United States military. And I commend you, Secretary Austin, for ordering the extremism stand down this past February to deal with the threat. You recognize this issue within the ranks, but I'm gravely concerned that too many of our military leaders do not. In April, at a Senate Armed Services Committee hearing, STRATCOM Commander Admiral Richards said he was, quote, very confident that the number of extremists in my forces is 0. And at the same hearing, General Dickinson, Commander of Space Command, echoed that assessment, claiming in the formations that I've had throughout my career, I have not seen that, so I believe it's close to 0 in my organization, if not 0. This ignores the clear evidence on this issue. A 2019 Military Times survey found more than 1/3 of active duty service members have witnessed white nationalism or ideologically driven racism in the ranks. You yourself, Secretary Austin, spoke of your experiences with extremism while you were in uniform. The Army CID's 2020 Gang and Domestic Extremist Activity Threat Assessment found a 66% increase in gang or domestic extremist activity from the previous year. And then in October of 2020, a Pentagon report to Congress detailed how domestic extremists actively recruit military personnel. We have a problem, the scope of which we don't fully understand. But Democrats and Republicans have asked the department for a definition of extremism. improved screening processes, and a status report on implementation of recommendations. You still have not yet received it. We have not received it, which is why just last week the House passed the fiscal year 22 NDAA, giving DOD additional authorities and resources to counter extremism in the department. So I was extremely disappointed to see the administration's statement of policy, which opposes the countering extremism provisions in the NDAA, citing overburdensome training and data collection requirements. Not a single sentence suggesting how to improve the provisions, just opposition to Congress. Congress is about to authorize and appropriate $768 billion to the department, nearly $25 billion more than the president's budget request, yet the administration views additional data collection and training requirements to counter the threat of extremism as onerous. We heard the same pushback when it came to addressing sexual assault in the military for 10 years before the department finally realized it was failing and that it needed greater tools. And we've documented systemic racism under the Uniform Code of Military Justice for at least 50 years, yet the department is making little, if any, progress to address that. Whether it's sexual assault or racial injustice, the department repeatedly tells Congress, we can handle it, commanders are responsible, we're studying it, we're ready to fight tonight. We cannot wait years, let alone decades, in the face of obstinance from the department before meeting the challenges of extremism in the armed forces. The time to address it is now. As this hearing reveals, there are many important issues for our military to address, in addition to the ongoing American-Afghan evacuations and anticipated over-the-horizon operations. We've got to care for our troops and the families, and that includes combating extremism in your formations in a way that we can take care of our troops and secure the nation. So please stop fighting Congress. Partner with us and accept the tools that you need to fix the problem. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. Mr. Kelly is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here. And Chairman Milley, I just want to start. I understand the conversation with the Chinese leader. What I don't understand is you going to the press, Chairman Milley, and that disappoints me that you talked to the press about that. None of the other stuff, I think you were, I'm okay with that. I'm not okay with you talking to the press or authors. I want to talk just a little bit about Bagram. There's 2 runways at Bagram and only 1 at HK. Is that correct?
That is correct.
So there's strategic value to 2 runways versus 1. You would agree with that?
It's entirely dependent on the mission.
Yeah, and the other thing is there's standoff versus an urban environment, and there are strategic advantages and disadvantages to that. You would agree with that, General McKenzie?
That's correct.
Okay. Now I want to talk a little bit about the strike on August the 29th, I think. Who set the rules of engagement? What were the rules of engagement? At what level?
So under the rules of engagement, and it would need to get into details in a classified setting, we have...
No, I don't want to know what the rules of engagement were. I want to know whose rules of engagement were they?
The U.S. military's rules of engagement.
Was that President Biden's? Was that Secretary Austin's? Was that CENTCOM's?
They are wholly neutral as to the party in power.
Okay.
It has nothing to do with the rules of engagement.
And I want to refer to a New York Times article on March 3rd described a policy change of the Biden administration that placed greater restrictions on drone strikes and raids conducted outside conventional battlefield zones. Previously authorized by ground commanders, these operations now require White House approval. Did the strike on August 28th or 29th, the one that killed 10 innocents, did it require presidential approval prior to the strike?
No, it did not.
Okay. At what level, who was the approval authority for that strike?
The target engagement authority was forward in the theater at the over-the-horizon cell that oversees those activities.
At what level? What, 1-star, 2-star, 3-star?
Flag officer level.
Flag officer level. Okay. And at what point, General McKenzie, and this is for all 3 of you, at what point did you know that the strike was bad, that it hit civilians?
Well, so we knew the strike hit civilians within 4 or 5 hours after the strike occurred. And U.S. Central Command released a press release to saying that. We did not know, though, that the target of the strike was in fact an error until a mistake until sometime later. It took us a few days to run that down.
Okay.
But we knew pretty soon after the strike.
Good deal. Secretary Austin, when did you know it was a bad strike that killed civilians?
As soon as General McKenzie reported that there were civilians that had been injured, and of course,
so 4 or 5 hours time frame. That's all I need.
right. Typically, as soon as that happens, we investigate. We begin an investigation.
No, when did you know that civilians were killed in that strike? That's my question. It's real easy. It's a time. It's not a. It doesn't take much to answer that.
Right. Several hours after that.
Okay. It's General Milley, same.
Same thing.
Okay. So I'm assuming there's 15-6s at multiple levels that we'll get to see those investigations. There's a lot of questions I have that have to be in a classified environment, but I hope that you guys know I also sit on a different committee that has different insight to this, and I think it's important that we know who authorized at what level and that we take accountability. Listen, I've made strikes. I've lived under rules of engagement. I've had rules of engagement that I liked and didn't like. I've had to make hard decisions. I hope most of them are right, but I understand. I don't want to blame some 06 or some 05. I want to make sure we get the level and that the rules of engagement were proper and that they were followed at whatever level. Who didn't follow those or either wrote those, because I think the strike was done to show we had over the horizon capabilities, and we didn't, because we reported a secondary explosion that was not. We reported all kind of stuff. Now, my next question is the other strike. Who did we kill?
I'd prefer to pass you that name in a classified setting.
Okay, can you tell me, was it an HVT or just a low-level terrorist?
I think it was a facilitator, and it was a good strike. I think we got someone who, while not directly involved in the attack on Abbey Gate on the 26th, certainly fell within that circle of accomplishment.
In a classified, I'd like to know that. And then my next question is, I just don't understand. I guess maybe I went to Union Public High School of 1100. My math, 11 to 15,000 U.S. citizens, 5,400 out. That leaves thousands, not hundreds, left that want to get out. And I know for a fact, every office here, we had people calling us wanting to get out, U.S. citizens that were not allowed to get in the gate or were kicked off the base or were not allowed out. And with that, I just ask, guys, we got to get our folks home. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Khanna is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General Milley, I want to first thank you for your 42 years of service, for your principled commitment to civilian rule, for your commitment to military communication that kept this country safe for 3 decades during the Cold War, and for the sacrifice and patriotism that you and your family has shown. As the son of immigrants, I'm in your family's debt. And I want to thank the 3 of you for ending America's longest war and executing the largest airlift in history. Now, Secretary Austin, you've testified that had 2,500 troops stayed past the deadline, the military would likely have needed reinforcements. And I want to just make this clear. The choice for President Biden wasn't 0 troops or 2,500 troops. It was 0 troops or potentially many more troops. General Milley, just briefly, would you agree that at some point more than 2,500 troops would have been needed had the Taliban engaged in offensive strikes?
I'm sorry. There's a reasonable prospect we would have had to increase forces past 2,500, given that the Taliban were very likely was going to start attacking us. And there's a range of forces. We're really talking about 2,500 to 4,500 in that range.
Appreciate that. Now, I want to talk about the strike that killed civilians. And I know, look, I think our military cares more about the loss of civilian life than any military in the world, any superpower ever in history. And that's why I think we ought to talk about this candidly. And I brought pictures of the 7 children who were killed, along with the 3 adults, to remind us that this is not what America wants. This is something that we need to prevent in the future. Press Secretary Kirby, who did a fine job during those 10 days, said you would support evacuating these family members as they have requested and resettling them in the U.S. Is that correct, Secretary Austin?
It is.
My question is, can we get the family and the coworkers evacuated now and brought to safety? I get the legal hoops, but could that happen after? Can we just get them into the U.S. or some safe place?
Well, we'll continue to work through State Department channels to engage the family, and if they desire to leave, then we'll certainly do everything we can to facilitate getting them out.
I hope we can just expedite that and expedite the compensation. It's the moral thing to do. It's the right thing to do. It's how America conducts itself, and so I hope you will take that into consideration. General McKenzie, I admire and respect your leadership, but I want to see how we can improve the intelligence to prevent these kind of strikes in the future. One aspect you said is that there was a white Toyota Corolla that led to the attacks. I'm sure you're aware, is there any car more common than a Toyota Corolla in Afghanistan?
It's a very common car. Of course, there were many other factors that went into that decision, not simply the fact it was a Toyota Corolla.
According to the Stars and Stripes, roughly 90% of cars registered in Afghanistan have been Corollas. One of the other things that concerned me is, based on my reading, and obviously you know more, the Corolla was parked next to a registered, U.S. registered California-based NGO that was delivering humanitarian assistance. And I guess the question is, did the DOD know about the NGO in advance of the strike?
I would prefer to, since that's under investigation now, I'd like to defer that question.
I would just hope that we can make sure going forward that our department will cross-check its intelligence to make sure that aid organizations are on no strike lists. I assume that if there is a aid organization or hospital, those are on no strike list?
As a representative, as are mosques, which are often used by ISIS-K as training sites as well.
All right. Again, I believe that our military goes through extraordinary lengths to prevent this. It's not to try to be an indictment of anyone. I just want to make sure we continue to improve the processes and that we do right by the families who were suffered this unspeakable tragedy. Thank you again to the three of you for your leadership, and thank you to everyone who served. Regardless of one's view in Afghanistan, I find the attacks on your integrity and patriotism to be a dishonor to this committee and a dishonor to your service.